Ever look at a map and wondered about the real uh, deep connections between people in places that seem so different?
Mm-hmm. Those hidden histories.
Exactly. Today, for you listening, we're diving into a really fascinating idea that could, well, maybe completely change how we see the genetic story of the Horn of Africa, particularly Ethiopia.
And what's interesting, I think, right from the start is that this isn't necessarily about brand new, like, DNA discoveries.
Oh, right.
It's more about looking at the information we already have, but maybe through a different lens, a fresh light,
That's a subtle shift, but with big implications.
potentially, yeah. Big implications for how we understand ancestry, how we talk about it.
Right. So we're going to unpack the common understanding of where the genetic makeup of the Horn of Africa comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And our guide for this deep dive is this really thought-provoking paper. It's called Reframing Admixture, a hypothesis on the mischaracterization of Horn of Africa genetic variation as non-African.
And it's from Ethio Helix, with apparently some AI assistance, which is kind of interesting in itself.
Yeah, that is interesting. Makes you think about how even the tools we use are changing and maybe prompting these kinds of reevaluations.
Absolutely. Constantly evolving.
Okay, so let's really get into this. Our mission today, as you listen along, is to understand why some scientists are now suggesting that these West Eurasian genetic bits, the ones we find in the Horn of Africa, why they might not actually be foreign admixture at all.
Right. What if there's something else?
And what does that actually mean for our understanding of human history? We're aiming for those moments where things kind of click,
Yeah, where you see a familiar topic, maybe African genetic diversity, in a completely new way.
Exactly. Moving beyond just like who moved where and when.
And getting into a more complex picture, maybe, how populations interacted, shared ancestry, perhaps over much longer periods than we usually think.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What's the usual story we hear about the genetics of this region?
Well, the standard view, the one you'll find in a lot of literature, is that people in the Horn of Africa, so think Ethiopia, Eritrea, parts of Sudan, Somalia, their current genetic makeup is often described as resulting from admixture, specifically admixture with groups from the Middle East or, more broadly, Eurasia.
Okay, and this isn't just like a guess. There's genetic evidence that points that way.
Oh, absolutely. It's based on genetic data. Study after study has shown that certain groups, especially highland populations like the Amhara and Tigrayans in Ethiopia,
Right.
they have a pretty significant chunk, maybe, 20 to 40% of their ancestry that looks genetically similar to ancient Near Eastern populations.
Like who specifically?
Like the early farmers in Anatolia or the Natufian hunter-gatherers from the Levant, pre-agricultural groups there.
Okay, so yeah, on the surface, that really does sound like people from elsewhere came in and mixed with local African populations. Straightforward admixture.
It seems straightforward, yes. But this paper, Ethio Helix, is really challenging that interpretation, or at least the framing of it.
So what's their main issue? What's the argument?
The core argument centers on that word, admixture. The paper argues that using this term, especially highlighting the Eurasian part, well, it implicitly, maybe unintentionally, frames these Horn African populations as being partly non-African.
Okay. Even though they are geographically, culturally, historically African.
Precisely. It's like saying, well, this part of you isn't really African, which the paper finds problematic.
That's a really interesting point. It's like focusing only on the ingredients that came from outside the kitchen, not the whole dish.
That's a great analogy. And admixture, by definition, implies two populations that were, separate for a significant time and then came back together.
Right.
The paper sort of asks, what if these ancestral populations weren't actually that separate to begin with? What if the geography or the genetics tells a different story?
And they also bring up something you mentioned earlier, this idea of how we talk about admixture. It's not always applied consistently, is it?
Exactly. That's a key point they make. We seem very quick to label this Near Eastern-like ancestry in the Horn as admixture. But think about other population interactions within Africa.
Right.
Well, for instance, the Bantu expansions. Massive movements of people interacting with Khoisan groups, Nilotic groups, Pygmy groups. Lots of genetic mixing.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we don't usually frame that primarily as, say, Nilotic populations are admixed with Bantu, or vice versa. We tend to talk about gene flow, population interaction. The admixture label seems applied more readily when one component is perceived as coming from outside sub-Saharan Africa.
So it's like there's a subtle bias, a default assumption that real African ancestry looks a certain way and anything different must be external.
That's essentially what the paper is suggesting,
Yeah.
that there might be this lingering, maybe subconscious assumption. And to understand where that might come from, we probably need to look back a bit.
History time. Okay, what's the historical context that might be influencing how we see this data today?
Well, the paper points pretty directly, actually, to the influence of early 20th century anthropology and its ideas about race.
Uh-oh. I think I know where this might be going.
Yeah, thinkers like Carlton Kuhn, for example. His typologies were really influential, though obviously discredited now.
Right, he had these classifications.
Exactly. He and others like him often classified people from the Horn of Africa and North Africa as Caucasoid or Hamitic, setting them apart from what they termed Negroid populations further south in Africa.
Wow. So these really outdated, frankly, racist classifications, the paper's arguing they might still echo today in how we interpret DNA.
That's the argument. Not that geneticists are consciously using Kuhn's categories, of course not, but that the underlying framework, this idea of a fundamental split, and that certain features found in the Horn must have an origin outside of a perceived sub-Saharan African norm, might still be subtly shaping the interpretation.
So the label admixture in this context could be unintentionally carrying forward some of that old baggage, assuming an external origin.
It could be. The paper suggests that the readiness to see it as external admixture might stem, in part, from this historical precedent of viewing Horn Africans as somehow distinct from or mixed with groups outside of a stereotypical African type.
Okay, so that leads us directly into challenging the label itself, not just admixture, but specifically West Eurasian.
Right.
The paper brings up this concept of basal Eurasian ancestry. What exactly is that? Can you break it down?
Sure. So basal Eurasian is a term for a really ancient hypothetical human lineage. The key idea is that it branched off from the ancestors of all other non-Africans very early on, like before those other non-African groups diversified.
Okay, so really deep roots. What makes it distinct?
One of the main things, genetically speaking, is that it seems to have minimal or possibly even zero admixture from Neanderthals.
Ah, unlike other groups who left Africa later and did mix with Neanderthals in Eurasia.
Exactly. That lack of Neanderthal ancestry makes it stand out.
And this basal Eurasian component, this is what scientists often see or model as a big part of that Near Eastern-like ancestry in Horn Africans.
Yes. When geneticists try to model the ancestry of Horn Africans, a significant chunk often gets attributed to this basal Eurasian lineage or populations that carried a lot of it, like those Anatolian farmers or Natufians we mentioned.
Okay, now here's the really crucial part, I think. The paper suggests that calling this basal Eurasian definitively Eurasian might be premature.
That's the core challenge. Why call it Eurasian if we're not entirely sure where it originated?
So where do scientists think it might have originated?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. We haven't actually found, like, ancient DNA from a pure basal Eurasian individual. It's an inferred component.
Right, it's theoretical based on modern and other ancient genomes.
Exactly. And here's the twist. Some studies, based on those patterns, actually suggest its origin point might have been somewhere around the southern Red Sea.
Wait, the southern Red Sea? That's right next to Northeast Africa. It could even be Northeast Africa.
Precisely. Geographically, it's very plausible it could have originated in Northeast Africa or maybe in nearby southern Arabia, with populations moving back and forth across a perhaps narrower Red Sea in the past.
So this component we've been labeling Eurasian, potentially implying it came from Eurasia into Africa, might actually have originated in Africa or right on its doorstep.
That's the possibility the paper highlights. It really challenges the narrative. If its origins are uncertain and could even be African, then labeling it Eurasian imposes an origin story that might not be accurate.
Wow. Okay. That changes things quite a bit.
It really does. It suggests we should be cautious about the geographical labels we attach to these ancient genetic components, especially when the evidence is still being pieced together. It opens up the door to thinking about a shared Afro-Arabian genetic landscape rather than distinct continental blocks.
So this completely reframes the admixture idea then. If these genetic components were circulating the broader Northeast African Red Sea region for ages, maybe even originating there.
Then calling it admixture, implying a relatively recent mixing of previously separate, distant groups, that term starts to feel less appropriate, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. It sounds more like regional variation or ancient gene flow within a connected zone.
Exactly. The paper argues that if the ancestors were essentially neighbors around the Red Sea, or part of a spectrum of variation within Northeast Africa itself, then admixture from a distant Eurasia isn't the most accurate description.
And connecting back to that earlier point about consistency,
Yes.
it highlights again why we might readily accept admixture for this, but not for, say, Bantu-Nilotic interactions. It's that ingrained idea of what's African versus external.
That selective application of the term is really what the paper puts under the microscope. It suggests our language might be revealing deeper assumptions.
Okay, let's pull this together then. What's the paper's central hypothesis, the main takeaway idea?
The core hypothesis is essentially this. The description of Horn Africans as being admixed with West Eurasian or Middle Eastern populations isn't just a neutral scientific description.
Okay.
It's also potentially shaped by these lingering Eurocentric frameworks, these older ideas about African populations. The paper proposes that what we're calling West Eurasian might in fact be an indigenous component of Northeast Africa's genetic landscape.
Indigenous, so part of the local ancient heritage.
Exactly. Part of the continent's own deep, diverse genetic story, not necessarily something brought in later from outside.
Okay, let's unpack the implications then. If we accept this reframing, what changes? Why does it matter for how we understand things?
Well, the implications are pretty significant, I think. First, and maybe most importantly, it firmly situates the peoples of the Horn within Africa's ancient and complex history.
So not as genetic outliers or hybrids.
Precisely. Not as anomalous populations partly defined by external input, but as an integral part of the African story from deep time. For you listening, it kind of challenges any neat boxes we might draw around continents and peoples. History is messy, interconnected.
That's a powerful shift in perspective. It counters any lingering ideas that they're somehow less authentically African.
Yes, it pushes back against that implicitly. And second, it suggests their genomes might be incredibly valuable for understanding ancient connections across the Red Sea region.
How so?
They might preserve lineages that were once widespread across both Northeast Africa and Arabia, remnants of a time when these areas were perhaps more genetically connected. They could hold keys to understanding the ancestry of people in both regions.
A shared heritage almost.
Potentially, yes. A much more fluid picture of ancient populations in that whole corridor.
Now, the paper doesn't just float this idea, right? It makes some concrete suggestions for researchers, for the field.
It does. It offers some recommendations for moving forward. First, it suggests using more geographically neutral terminology.
Instead of West Eurasian.
Exactly. Maybe something like Red Sea corridor ancestry or Northeast African, Southwest Asian ancestry terms that don't automatically bake in an assumption about a single point of origin outside Africa.
That seems sensible. Language matters.
It really does. Simple changes can shift perspective. Second, it encourages exploring different population models.
What kind of models?
Models that allow for parallel evolution or deep shared ancestry within the broader Northeast African Arabian region, or complex back-and-forth gene flow, not just simple one-way admixture events from Eurasia into Africa, basically opening up the possibilities.
Right. Don't just default to the simplest admixture story. Consider more complex local histories.
Precisely. Third, and this is a big one, the paper stresses the urgent need for more ancient DNA.
From where specifically?
Especially from Northeast Africa itself, and also from Southern Arabia. We have relatively little ancient DNA from these crucial regions compared to, say, Europe or the Levant.
And that ancient DNA would be key to actually figuring out the direction of gene flow, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It's the direct evidence. Did these lineages move out of Africa? Into Africa? Was it a two-way street over millennia? Ancient DNA is our best bet to resolve those questions definitively for you trying to follow the evidence.
Can't solve the puzzle without all the pieces. Makes sense.
And the final point is a bit more conceptual. It's a call for the scientific community to actively be aware of and to question these historical biases, the colonial-era racial thinking that might still unconsciously influence scientific interpretation and communication.
So a call for critical self-reflection within the science itself.
Exactly. Asking, why do we frame it this way? Are there other valid interpretations? It's about ensuring our historical context doesn't unduly skew our understanding of the data.
It's a good reminder that science operates within culture and history, doesn't it? It's not totally separate.
It never is. Being aware of those influences is crucial for striving towards a more objective and, frankly, more accurate picture of the human past.
Okay, so to sort of wrap this up for everyone listening. The key takeaway here is that the genetic story of the Horn of Africa is probably a lot more complex and potentially much more deeply rooted in Africa than the standard admixture narrative often suggests.
Yeah, that term admixture, while seeming technical and neutral, might actually be obscuring a richer, more ancient, and ultimately more interconnected African story in this region.
And the author concludes, as you said, that rethinking this isn't just like a minor scientific tweak.
No, they frame it as something more significant. A decolonial imperative is the phrase used, I believe. A move towards a more accurate, less biased, and more respectful understanding of African genetic heritage and history.
That really lands with impact. It makes you think, how much a scientific language carries hidden weight.
It certainly does. And for anyone trying to understand these complex topics, it really underscores how important it is to always ask, why this word? Why this framework?
This whole deep dive, it really gives you something to chew on.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what other historical narratives, maybe even stories we tell about ourselves, are shaped by the specific lens we use to interpret information.
Mm-hmm.
Good, looking again at our basic assumptions, questioning the frameworks like this paper does, lead us to a richer, maybe more truthful understanding of our shared human story.
That's a fantastic question to leave people with. It speaks to the power of critical thinking, not just in science, but everywhere. Questioning the narrative is often where new understanding begins.
Well, this has just been a glimpse into a really fascinating area of research.
Mhm.
We definitely encourage you to keep exploring the complexities of human genetic history and maybe pay a little closer attention to the words we use to describe it all.